The smell of smoke clung to my hair like a curse. Hours earlier, my home, my sanctuary, was nothing but a smoldering skeleton under the winter moon. And then, she walked in. Bryn Ashworth Sterling, 45 years old, silver Tesla, designer athleisure like a costume for a suburban queen pin, and she strutted into my courtroom, my domain, like she'd just won. The same woman who had set fire to my life was now standing under the same roof where I held the power to decide hers. There's a special kind of arrogance that comes from thinking the law doesn't apply to you. I'd seen it before. Drug lords, white-collar predators, sociopaths who smile through sentencing. But Bryn? She had the gall to look me in the eye, as if the ash under my fingernails was just a coincidence. She didn't know that I'd been a judge for 20 years, or maybe she did and didn't care. Either way, when you burn down a federal judge's house, you better pray she never gets to return the favor, legally, and I was already sharpening the knife. 6 months earlier, before my world turned to embers, I was a woman with grief in my bones. Harold, my husband of 28 years, was gone, cancer taking him in slow, cruel inches. The house we'd built our lives in felt like a mausoleum, every creak in the floorboards a reminder that he wasn't there to tell me it was nothing. Pinewood Estates used to be simple. Retired teachers pruning roses, kids on bikes carving their first freedom into the pavement. Then came the money. Glass-front McMansions swallowing up the old ranch homes, and Bryn was the tip of that spear, HOA president, self-anointed savior of the neighborhood. Her version of saving meant purging anyone who didn't fit her vision of perfection. The first time we met, I was building Harold's memorial fence. 6 feet of privacy we'd planned together so we could drink coffee without the world watching. He didn't offer condolences. She measured my fence with a pink tape measure and told me it was 2 inches too high, $500 fine. Except, it wasn't. I'd hired a surveyor. The rule didn't exist. That's when I remembered her face, from my courtroom 3 years ago, when I'd caught her husband's company trying to scam an 80-year-old veteran out of 30 grand. I'd crushed them in court. This fence wasn't about height, it was about payback. And that was her first mistake. It started small, the way termites eat a foundation from the inside before you ever see the damage. The first letter arrived in a thick manila envelope, the kind lawyers and predators favor. Violation notice number 1. Unapproved decorative garden feature. The crime? A granite memorial stone for Harold tucked beneath his rose bushes. Apparently my grief didn't fit Pinewood's uniform landscape aesthetic. $200 fine. 3 days later came violation notice number 2, mailbox color out of regulation. My black mailbox had been standing there since Ronald Reagan was in office. Suddenly it was a visual hazard. $150 fine. Then violation notice number 3, excessive bird feeding, creating nuisance conditions. Harold loved cardinals. Feeding them was my one quiet ritual in the mornings, coffee steam mingling with the crisp air, watching those flashes of red against the frost. Apparently, that was now a neighborhood crisis. $500 fine. She was probing my defenses, seeing if I'd break. But here's the thing. Most people panic when they see official paper. I'd spent 2 decades tearing apart cases built on lies and procedural errors. And Bryn's letters? They were full of holes big enough to drive her Tesla through. Colorado law is clear. HOA fines must be reasonable, tied to actual violations, and grounded in adopted bylaws. Bryn's citations were as fake as her spray tan, non-existent rules, no hearing notices, no proper documentation. It was amateur hour, except amateurs don't usually have a personal vendetta. I spent 3 nights in Harold's basement office, surrounded by the smell of old legal volumes and dust. I photographed every inch of my property. I documented every letter, every date, every word. I built spreadsheets of her violations, hers, not mine. I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Real Estate Commission. But she wasn't satisfied with paperwork warfare. One Thursday morning, while I was sentencing a drunk driver, my new security cameras caught her on my property. She wasn't alone. She brought an entourage, her skeletal interior designer, head-to-toe white, and her personal trainer, clipboard in hand, looking like he'd never read a single regulation in his life. For 2 hours they prowled my yard, pointing, measuring, and pretending Harold's roses were some kind of violation against humanity. Watching the footage that night, my jaw locked. This wasn't neighborhood maintenance. This was the opening act of a much bigger crime. And somewhere in my gut, I knew. Bryn wasn't just trying to control Pinewood. She was building something far darker. The day Bryn crossed from harassment into felony was a Tuesday, quiet, brittle with early frost. I was downtown sentencing a wife-beater to 18 months when my phone pinged with a security alert. Motion detected in the backyard. I checked the feed that night thinking maybe it was a stray raccoon. Instead, there she was, Bryn Ashworth Sterling in designer yoga pants, pink tape measure in hand, strutting across my lawn like she'd bought the deed at auction. She pressed her face against my kitchen window, shielding her eyes, peering in at Harold's coffee mug still sitting on the counter, the one I hadn't been able to wash since he died. Then she did something deliberate, calculated. She unlatched my back gate, tugged it wide, and walked away with a satisfied smirk. By the time I got home, the gate hung open like a wound in my sanctuary, and Gavel, my 14-year-old tabby, Harold's last gift to me, was gone. He was just a pet. He'd been Harold's chemo companion, curling in his lap through the worst nights, purring him towards sleep. Losing him was losing Harold all over again. I searched for 3 days, my voice cracking from calling his name, canvassing alleys and storm drains in a 6-block radius. Walt Henderson, my old neighbor, organized search parties. Even the Rodriguez family, driven out of Pinewood months ago by Bryn's harassment, came back to help. The call came on the 3rd night. Mountain View Animal Emergency. Dr. Martinez's voice was soft, measured. "We have a cat matching your description. He's in bad shape." Gavel lay in an oxygen tent, ribs broken, dehydrated, eyes dull with trauma. The vet's words made my hands tremble. These injuries are consistent with being chased by machinery, high-powered leaf blowers, maybe lawn equipment. The security footage confirmed it. 1 hour after Bryn's trespass, her landscaping crew had entered my yard with industrial blowers, terrorizing Gavel until he bolted. They chased him 2 blocks before he fell into a storm drain. This wasn't HOA enforcement anymore. This was cruelty, malice, a targeted strike against the last living thread tying me to my husband. And Bryn had made the fatal mistake of leaving me with evidence, footage, timestamps, witnesses. She'd just handed a sitting judge the keys to her own prosecution. My grief had been fuel before. Now it was gunpowder. I didn't sleep the night Gavel came home from surgery. His breathing was shallow, his fur shaved in patches where IV lines had been, and every rise and fall of his tiny chest felt like a coin flip with fate. I sat beside him on the couch, my hand resting lightly on his side, and stared at the security footage over and over, not because I needed to see it again, but because I wanted to burn every frame into my memory. At 8:17 a.m., Bryn stepped through my gate. At 9:26 her crew arrived. At 9:42 Gavel fled. By 10:05 he was gone from the cameras. There was no guesswork here, no maybe. This was a chain of events so cleanly documented it could be taught in law school as an example of direct causation. The next morning I filed criminal charges for unlawful entry and animal cruelty. Then I called Sarah Morgan from Channel 7, a journalist I'd known for years. Sarah was a predator in her own right, the kind who hunted corruption like it owed her money. 3 nights later, Judge versus HOA, when Watchdog's attack aired across Colorado, Bryn's trespass footage played on repeat, the blowers, the open gate, Gavel's limp body being pulled from the storm drain. The story ignited social media. #JusticeForGavel was everywhere. People didn't just send sympathy, they sent money. Donations poured in for vet bills and legal costs, and the floodgates opened. 5 other families came forward with horror stories. The Johnsons, fined into bankruptcy for installing a wheelchair ramp for their disabled son. Mrs. Morgan, forced to dismantle her late husband's memorial garden. A single mother cited for defacing property after her children drew chalk rainbows on their own driveway. Bryn hadn't just declared war on me, she'd been waging one on anyone who didn't fit her vision of a perfect Pinewood. The Colorado Attorney General's office called me personally. Civil rights violations were now on the table. That night, for the first time since Harold's funeral, I slept. Not because the fight was over, but because I finally saw the battlefield clearly. This wasn't grief anymore. This was war. And I wasn't just defending my home, I was dismantling a petty tyrant's empire. But Bryn wasn't done. Cornered animals don't surrender. They bite, and her next move was designed to destroy me before I could destroy her. The envelope arrived by certified mail, thick, official, and heavy in my hands. The return address made my stomach tighten. Colorado Judicial Discipline Commission. Inside was Bryn's masterpiece of fiction. She accused me of abusing judicial authority to intimidate law-abiding homeowners, of weaponizing the legal system for personal vendettas, of threatening community safety. It was every buzzword designed to trigger an ethics investigation. The evidence was almost laughable, if it weren't so dangerous. Doctored photographs turning Harold's memorial garden into a junk heap. Fabricated witness statements from her interior designer and trainer, swearing I'd threatened them. Timestamps that wouldn't survive 30 seconds of scrutiny in my courtroom. But Bryn hadn't written this for the commission. She'd written it for the press. Within hours, the smear was on every blog that had ever taken a shot at me for my environmental rulings. Liberal judge terrorizes patriotic HOA became the headline of the week. Comment sections lit up with people demanding my impeachment, my disbarment, and in some cases, things far worse. It's a strange thing watching 20 years of public service shredded by strangers who can't spell jurisprudence but somehow think they understand constitutional law better than you. For 72 hours, I said nothing. That silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Because you don't answer a smear with emotion. You answer it with a knife made of truth. And then, salvation knocked, literally. Patricia Donnelly stood on my porch in a sensible cardigan, orthopedic shoes, and a smile that belonged on a retired librarian. But Pat wasn't here to return books. She was a 25-year FBI veteran specializing in financial crimes, and she had been quietly investigating Bryn for weeks. "Judge," she said, stepping into Harold's office, "I think you should see this." She laid out photographs like cards in a poker game, insurance claims, bankruptcy filings, falsified identities. Bryn had pulled this act before: flood, fire, vandalism, hundreds of thousands in payouts, all before a grand jury could convene. She wasn't just an HOA president, she was a career fraudster. And suddenly, the harassment made sense. I wasn't her only target, I was her distraction. Pat's hands didn't shake as she spread the evidence across my kitchen table. Insurance applications, bank transfers, HOA financial statements with gaps wide enough to swallow a small country. "This," she said, tapping one document, "isn't incompetence. It's orchestration." Bryn's homeowner's insurance valued her $800,000 property at $2.8 million. She'd lied about prior claims, past addresses, even her name. Her legal identity in Pinewood Estates, Bryn Ashworth Sterling, was just one of several aliases. Pat walked me through it like a professor dissecting a case study. She moves into an established neighborhood, creates friction, pushes out residents who resist, files inflated insurance claims tied to safety hazards and structural issues she manufactures. By the time anyone starts asking questions, she's liquidated assets, filed bankruptcy, and vanished. The HOA presidency? That's just her bank key. I sat there, staring at the paper trail, feeling the same mix of awe and disgust I'd felt sentencing master criminals in court. Bryn wasn't just a narcissistic bully with too much time on her hands, She was running a full-blown fraud enterprise under the cover of suburban civility. And I'd been playing defense. Pat slid over a final folder, thicker than the rest. HOA emergency funds, $340,000, gone. Disappeared in the last 18 months under vendor payments to shell companies linked to Bryn's aliases. She's already laid the groundwork for her exit, Pat said. Your house is next. She's filed preliminary claims about developing structural damage and neighborhood safety concerns. If she can't push you out with fines and harassment, she'll make you collateral damage in her next payout. That's when the air shifted. The fence fights, the bogus violations, the trespassing. It wasn't personal spite, it was camouflage. Age. While I was swatting at her petty offenses, she'd been robbing the entire community blind. I looked down at Gavel, curled weakly in his blanket, his slow breathing a reminder of exactly what she'd already taken from me. My grief wasn't the point anymore. This was about every single person she'd fleeced, every home she'd targeted, every life she'd quietly bulldozed to fund her empire. And that's when the anger crystallized into something sharper. No more counterpunches, no more defense. It was time to go for the throat. I've always believed the best legal strategies are like surgery, precise, deliberate, and irreversible once the first cut is made. That night, surrounded by Pat's evidence and Harold's old law books, I began sharpening the scalpel. Step 1. Lock the gates. I upgraded my security system to military grade, cameras, motion sensors, digital backups routed to an off-site server Bryn couldn't touch. Every second of her existence near my property would now be recorded from 3 angles. Step 2. Sever her escape routes. I reached out to the Colorado Attorney General's office, forwarding Pat's financials and Bryn's falsified insurance applications. Simultaneously, I filed civil suits in county court, not for harassment, but for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and embezzlement of HOA funds. The goal wasn't just to win, it was to freeze her assets before she could vanish. Step 3. Control the narrative. I invited Sarah Morgan back, not for another evening news piece, but for a deep dive exposé. We filmed interviews with every victim Pat and I could find. Families forced out, elderly residents stripped of dignity, single parents bled dry by fabricated fines. Their pain became the spine of the story. And then came step 4, the most personal cut. I filed a petition to have Bryn removed as HOA president on the grounds of gross misconduct and financial mismanagement. This wasn't symbolic. It was a legal noose, one she wouldn't be able to wriggle out of without publicly revealing her own criminal trail. But strategy is nothing without timing. You don't move until the pressure has built so high the other side can't tell where it's coming from. So I kept my head down, let Bryn think she was regaining control. She even sent me another violation notice. Unauthorized lawn ornament, citing the bird bath Harold had given me on our 10th anniversary. I smiled when I read it, because every letter she sent, every false statement she made, every step she took was now another brick in the wall closing around her. This wasn't about my fence anymore. This was about dismantling the entire castle she'd built on lies. And when it came down, I wanted her to feel every stone hit her on the way down. Desperation has a smell. It's sharp, metallic, like the air before lightning strikes. By the second week of my quiet campaign, Bryn reeked of it. Her perfect suburban composure began to slip. At HOA meetings, she snapped at members over minor landscaping questions. She called emergency sessions for trivial matters, a neighbor's recycling bin left out too long, a child's basketball hoop visible from the street. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control slipping through her fingers. Then came the escalation. One morning I found the tires on my car slashed, 4 clean cuts, precise as a surgeon's scalpel. No robbery, no vandalism beyond that. A message, not a crime of opportunity. The security footage caught only the back of a hooded figure, but the build, the stride. It was her. That same day, Pat called. She's moving money, fast, offshore transfers in the last 48 hours. She's trying to liquidate before the Attorney General freezes her accounts. It was the first time Pat sounded urgent. We may need to accelerate. Acceleration meant exposing our hand before every piece was in place. It meant risking her slipping through the cracks. But it also meant preventing whatever her last desperate move might be. That night, Sarah Morgan aired the first half of our exposé, just enough to turn Pinewood Estates into a war zone. Phones rang off the hook. Residents demanded an emergency vote to suspend Bryn's authority until the investigation was over. For the first time, her power didn't feel inevitable. The next day, she showed up at my gate. No sunglasses, no clipboard, just her face, raw and flushed, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "You think you can ruin me?" she said, voice low and trembling. "You have no idea who I know. You have no idea what I can do." It wasn't a threat, it was a confession, because only someone who's already lost starts talking like that. I let her stand there, breathing hard, until the motion sensor clicked and the gate closed between us. The war was almost over. But wounded predators don't just run, they lash out. And Bryn was about to prove just how dangerous she could be when cornered. It happened just after midnight. The cameras picked it up first. A shadow moving along the side of my house, low and deliberate. Within seconds, the motion sensors triggered the floodlights, and for a moment, the intruder froze in the glare. It wasn't Bryn herself this time. It was a man, tall, built like a linebacker, with a ski mask pulled tight. He wasn't there to talk. The footage showed him heading straight for the utility box. Within seconds, my power was cut. Every light, every hum of the refrigerator, gone. A blackout. But the backup battery kept the cameras rolling, and I watched from my phone as he slipped a crowbar into the lock on my back door. Pat's voice was in my ear before I could dial. She'd been running a stakeout, suspecting Bryn might make a last move. "Stay where you are," she said. "I'm 2 minutes out." But 2 minutes is a lifetime when someone's inside your house. I moved to Harold's old desk, hand closing around the pepper so. Pray I kept in the top drawer. My heart wasn't pounding, it was steady, methodical. I'd spent my life facing down dangerous people from a bench. This was just closer. Footsteps creaked on the hardwood, a pause. Then the slow, deliberate sound of drawers being opened. He wasn't looking for me. He was looking for evidence. When Pat burst through the front door with 2 uniformed officers, the man bolted. They caught him halfway down the street. His name didn't matter. What mattered was the cash in his pocket and the text thread on his phone. It was Bryn. The messages were blunt. Take the files. Make it look like a break-in. No witnesses. It was the first piece of irrefutable direct evidence tying her to criminal activity that would land her behind bars, and she'd handed it to us in a fit of desperation. The next morning I filed an emergency petition with the court, not only for her immediate removal as HOA president, but for a restraining order and a criminal referral to the state's fraud division. Bryn wasn't a neighbor anymore. She was a defendant. And now the clock was ticking. Not for me, but for her. It was a Tuesday morning when the sirens came. I was sipping coffee on the porch, the late summer air heavy with the smell of cut grass, when the first black SUV rolled into Pinewood Estates. Then another, and another. Neighbors stepped out onto their lawns, shielding their eyes from the flashing lights as the convoy stopped in front of Bryn's house. Agents in windbreakers fanned out across her pristine yard. One carried a battering ram, though they didn't need it. Bryn opened the door herself. For a moment she stood there framed in the doorway wearing a silk robe like she'd been expecting them, but the tightness around her mouth betrayed her. The lead agent read the charges: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, solicitation of criminal activity. Words that sound cold on paper but land like hammer blows when read aloud in front of your neighbors with cameras rolling. Sarah Morgan was there too. She hadn't needed an invitation. Her crew caught every second. Bryn being handcuffed, her wrists flashing pale against the dark sleeves of her robe, the agents carrying out boxes of files, the moment her immaculate front lawn became a staging ground for justice. And the neighborhood, oh, they turned. People who'd once stayed silent, afraid of fines or retaliation, now whispered openly on their porches. Some shouted things, ugly, bitter truths they'd swallowed for years. Mrs. Albright, who Bryn had forced to tear down her late husband's workshop, stood with tears on her cheeks and said, "I told you she'd get hers." When the SUV door slammed behind Bryn, it wasn't just metal on metal. It was the sound of a reign ending. The Attorney General's office held a press conference that afternoon confirming what Pat and I already knew. Bryn's HOA management was a front for a multi-state fraud operation, siphoning millions over more than a decade. That night, I walked past her darkened house, the for sale sign already staked into the lawn by a realtor who clearly didn't want to answer questions. The perfect landscaping she'd lorded over for years suddenly looked fake, like a stage set after the actors have gone home. For the first time in months, Pinewood Estates felt quiet. But I also knew quiet doesn't mean safe. Because people like Bryn don't just vanish when the cameras turn off. Trials aren't just about the crime, they're about the story. And when you're dealing with someone like Bryn, the story is rarely limited to what's in the indictment. Pat and I met with the state's lead prosecutor in a sterile conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paper dust. The walls were lined with bankers' boxes labeled Pinewood HOA evidence. Inside, financial ledgers, falsified maintenance contracts, offshore bank statements, and my personal favorite, handwritten notes from Bryn herself, outlining strategy for dealing with problem homeowners. I was in those notes. So was Pat, and half the neighborhood. But the real bombshell wasn't about us. The prosecutor slid a manila folder across the table. "You should see this." Inside were records from 3 other states: Oregon, Nevada, Arizona. Each one told the same story. An HOA president with a different name, but the same face in the DMV photo. Different victims, same tactics. Fines, foreclosures, intimidation. And every time, she disappeared just before legal action caught up to her. Bryn wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a career predator. The paper trail stretched back nearly 20 years, every move carefully planned, every identity change timed to dodge warrants and lawsuits. She had perfected the art of wearing legitimacy like a mask, until now. But predators adapt under threat, and she wasn't sitting quietly in a cell. Her new attorney, a high-priced defense shark out of Denver, was already flooding the court with motions to suppress evidence, claiming the break-in at my house was unrelated and inadmissible. Pat leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. She's not fighting for a win. She's fighting for a mistrial. The prosecutor nodded grimly. If she can drag this out long enough, witnesses get tired. People move. Evidence disappears. That's her game. We spent hours mapping out a counter-strategy, tight timelines, ironclad witness prep, airtight chains of custody. And I knew my role wasn't over. I wasn't just a victim. I was going to be a star witness. Walking out of that building, I realized something chilling. This trial wasn't just about bringing Bryn down. It was about making sure she could never, ever start over again somewhere else. And for that, I'd have to be more relentless than she'd ever been. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and nerves. Reporters clustered by the front steps, cameras aimed at the heavy oak doors like they were waiting for a celebrity. In a way, they were. Bryn arrived flanked by her defense team, dressed in a slate gray suit and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't look like an inmate, she looked like she was about to host a board meeting. Inside, the air was thick with quiet hostility. The gallery was packed. Neighbors, former allies, even people from the other states Pat had uncovered, All of them had a story. All of them wanted to see her fall. The prosecutor opened with precision, laying out the paper trail, the forged contracts, the break-in attempt. He made it simple. This is about power, money, and fear. But Bryn's lawyer didn't go for the expected denial. Instead, he stood, buttoned his jacket, and turned toward the jury with an almost disarming ease. "My client," he said, "is not the villain she's been painted as. She is a woman who has been the target of a coordinated smear campaign by disgruntled residents with personal grudges. They have conspired to frame her, using falsified evidence and manipulated media coverage." Then he did something that made the room shift. He named me. Not just as a witness, but as the ringleader of this so-called conspiracy. He painted me as a bitter former judge who had lost a property dispute with the HOA and vowed revenge. He implied that the break-in at my house was staged. It was a calculated strike aimed not at proving her innocence, but at muddying the water enough to confuse the jury. I felt the heat of a dozen eyes on me. Pat from the row behind leaned forward and whispered, "This is just the opening punch. Don't flinch." The rest of the day blurred. Evidence entered, objections fired, the judge keeping a tight rein on both sides. But the seed had been planted. Bryn wasn't going to win by proving she was good. She was going to try to win by making me look worse. And I knew exactly what that meant. The next few weeks wouldn't just be about her on trial. It would be about me surviving it. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for the trial to grind through witnesses, evidence, and enough objections to fill a law textbook. I sat in the witness box for hours over those days, answering question after question, never letting my voice shake. The defense tried every angle, my age, my past rulings as a judge, my supposed vendetta. But each time the prosecutor pulled us back to the facts. The ledgers didn't lie. The emails didn't lie. The man Bryn sent to my house didn't lie. When closing arguments came, the prosecutor stood before the jury and said, "This case isn't about HOA disputes. It's about a pattern of deception and exploitation that spans decades. You have the power to stop it here." Bryn's attorney leaned hard into his narrative, painting her as a misunderstood leader, a scapegoat. But even his voice seemed to lack the conviction it had on day one. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the afternoon of the second day, the bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom. "All rise." I stood, my palms damp against the wood of the pew in front of me. The forewoman's voice was clear, steady. "On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, guilty. On the charge of solicitation of criminal activity, guilty." Each guilty landed like a hammer. Bryn sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but I saw the twitch in her jaw. For the first time, she wasn't in control. The judge sentenced her to 22 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for at least 15. The cameras were waiting when they led her away in shackles. Neighbors stood outside the courthouse, some cheering, some simply watching in stunned silence. That night, Pinewood Estates was quiet again. Real quiet. No notices taped to doors, no strange cars parked at the curb. The HOA met without fear for the first time in years, electing a new president, a neighbor who actually believed in community. Pat and I sat on my porch as the sun went down, sipping coffee. "Think she'll appeal?" Pat asked. "Probably," I said. "People like her always think he's another move." But deep down, I knew her game was over. Because sometimes justice doesn't just end the story, it locks the door behind it.